Hey guys, welcome back to Oopsie Daisy. We're just going to start this podcast off with a super random fact about me is that I always podcast with shoes on. I don't know what it is about my brain, but I feel like when I have shoes on, laced up, and I'm doing these podcasts, I just feel like my life is together. I feel with it. I feel in control. I feel focused. And I hit record today with my butt in this seat and I am barefoot. So it might not seem like a big deal to you, but this is the first time in hours behind this microphone that I have not done this with shoes on. So I'm footloose and fancy free. This could either be the best thing that ever happened to us, or this could implode very quickly. So stay tuned. We'll see what happens. I will be honest, I'm a little wiggly about this episode. And I say wiggly because I'm excited to talk about it. I think it is an important topic. I know it has helped me a lot since I've been learning about it. But reality is I've only been thinking about this for a few days. And normally when I record an episode for you guys, it's been something I've been thinking about for a while, or I've been processing for a while. And so when I sat down to record, I had a whole nother podcast idea. We were going to talk about a totally different topic. And so I prayed and I said, okay, God, what do you want your people to know? And this idea was just obsessively rolling around in my brain. So I went with it because he's smarter than I am. So I had to study my little buns off and really kind of shape this message up fairly quickly. So we'll see how it goes. It's either going to be 12 minutes or like 97. So hang in. So I really feel like God wants to talk to us today about wilderness seasons and transitions and just general seasons in our life. So I don't know about you. I feel deeply the transitions and the phases and the certain like chunks of my life. And I can feel when they're ending, and I can really sense when a new one is starting. And I thought this was something that everybody felt. So we were in church about a couple months ago, and I just had that feeling. I had that feeling that we were on the edge of something really new. I didn't know what it was. It wasn't like I was like, oh, this is what's next in our lives. But I just had this feeling of there's a door that's open and we're about to walk through it. And so I lean over to my husband and I say, do you feel like everything is different now? Do you feel like we're about to step into something brand new? And I look at him and I'm fully expecting him to go with me on this and be like, oh yeah, babe, you nailed it. I totally feel that too. But he looks at me like I am an absolute lunatic. And he just goes, no. And so I had this like moment of, we're moving in, guys. We're moving into a new territory, a new season, a new level. And he was like, nope, don't feel that way. Don't feel the same at all. So if you are one of those people that senses the transitions of your life, you get me. You get what that feels like. If you're not, let's talk about it a little bit. When I am in a season of transition, when something is kind of coming to an end or there's something new that's opening up, I often feel this squeeze. And what it makes me think of is, do you remember, what's her name? Violet Beauregard from Willy Wonka? The girl that was super greedy and she chewed the gum all the time, and then she turned into a huge blueberry and they had to roll her out of the Oompa Loompas rolled her out of the factory. So this is what I picture in a transition season, that I'm Violet as a blueberry and they're trying to shove me through the door of the factory, and they squeeze and they squeeze and they push and they prod from all sides until all of a sudden, bloop, I just pop out the other side with my giant roly-poly body. And so that's what I feel like when I'm in transition and right before something new happens. And so a lot of times people call that squeezing or that waiting or that time before you really step into the next level or your next thing. People call that the wilderness. It's really just a period of waiting. It's that period of in between where you're still kind of in this old thing. Might be a job, might be a relationship, might be a house, might be a geographical location, might be just something emotionally where you're ready for something new. That's your wilderness. A lot of times wilderness has a really negative connotation where it's like cold and dark and bad. And honestly, it can feel that way. but not always. It's really just the middle period between something old and something new. That's the wilderness, where you're not quite there yet, but you're losing sight of what's current or what you were doing before. Let's talk about some more signs or signals that you might be in your own wilderness season. So the first one is feeling stuck. You are kind of restless where you're at. You're looking for something new. You kind of have this sense of dis-ease in your heart, and everything in your current season feels like it doesn't really fit anymore. And you might even be stewarding two things at this time. So you're doing something old, something normal, something regular that you've always done, but there's also something new that you're working on or planning for. So you might actually be really straddling the old and the new during this wilderness season. And so, like I said, it's like this kind of restless, discontent feeling. And it's almost like putting on clothes that are a little bit too small. They're a little restrictive, and you don't really feel right in your own skin, and you can't really identify why. This may also be a season of loneliness. You might feel like withdrawing a little bit to kind of be more introspective. You might not be your super outgoing self. You're just kind of working on some inside things. This can also cause you to wander without a purpose. So when you can't really see what's coming next in your life, that's really hard because you feel a sense of, I know I'm not supposed to be doing what I'm doing now, but I'm not quite sure what I'm supposed to be doing next. And so you kind of wander aimlessly without this purpose. There's a frustration as you wait for what's next. You feel like, oh, I can't, this just needs to be over. This needs to be done. I want to leave this place. I want to get out. I want to change. I need a new space, I need a new race, new location, change of scenery. God might also feel distant to you during this time. I've gone through my own seasons where I feel like I'm stuck somewhere, but I feel like I'm not getting any clear direction from Him either. So it's like I'm banging on the doors of heaven and nobody's really opening the door to tell me what's happening. So if you feel God silent, you might be in a wilderness in between season too. It may also feel like you have no movement or no momentum. It's like you're humming along the highway with your car, and all of a sudden it just runs out of gas and stalls out, and you have no idea why. You don't know how to fix it. Nothing you're doing to try to solve these current or old problems is really making progress anymore. Another thing, and this is one of the big ones that I have a lot, is that old habits, usually bad habits, will tend to flare up. So you'll deal with a habit or a sin or a vice or an addiction that you thought you mastered. Maybe this is a mindset or a feeling or a pattern of thinking, and you thought you had mastered this, conquered this, moved past this, and it wasn't an issue anymore. But all of a sudden, it just starts creeping back. There's new temptation in that area. Your mind is really under attack in that area. That might be a sign that you are in your wilderness season. Let's be honest, this place is not a comfortable place. It feels dark sometimes, it feels super slow, and it feels really, really pointless, and it's frustrating. But we can learn to walk well through our wilderness. We can win the wilderness season if we choose to have a new perspective on it. So instead of just racing through it to try to get it over with, instead of wondering how long you're going to be there and why things are so bad, we can choose to look for God's fingerprints in this season. And we can choose to see how God is using this season for a purpose. And He really does. He uses this season 1,000-fold in your life. How do I know this? Well, I've lived it. Lived it multiple times. I've had major transitions in my life that have all kind of tracked in similar ways and felt very similar. So I've lived it, and I know He does it for a reason. And the other way is it's in Scripture. So over the next couple podcasts, we're going to be covering the journey of the Israelites as they escaped from Egypt. They left Egypt, and they're on their way to the promised land. And so what we're going to do is examine how God uses their wilderness time to accomplish some major things in their life back then. But as we go through this, yes, please think about the Israelites, but I need you to think about a place where you feel like you're in a wilderness season. Your whole life doesn't necessarily have to be in the wilderness. Everything doesn't have to be going wrong. There are parts that might be going super well. Like your kids might be great and parenting is awesome, but your marriage is in the wilderness and you're kind of stuck. Or your family and your home life is amazing, but you really feel like you're in a wilderness season with your job. So I need you to take a minute, even before we start, feel free to press pause and just think about and ask God, where is my wilderness? What am I stuck between? Where do I feel this way? And that's really going to help you apply some of these as we go forward. And you might see yourself and identify your situation as we go through this podcast. But I really, really want you to know that this Old Testament stuff isn't old as in not relevant. This is super relevant stuff for our life here that we can draw some real life learnings and applications from. So just because it's from like the time of Moses, don't tune out. It is so, so encouraging and educational and just really helps us kind of understand what we're going through. Through the next couple podcasts, we're going to be literally speeding through the Israelites' journey from Exodus into Numbers. So you better just buckle up. Hold on tight. There's going to be a lot that we cover. I'm going to throw some scripture at you. Feel free to write it down. Just do what you got to do to hang with. We're going to class today, people. Let me give you a little bit of a background. So the story of the Israelites spans from Exodus, Numbers, and into Deuteronomy. And it crosses like 3 major periods in their history or in their journey. The first is in Egypt. So the Egyptians had enslaved the Israelites for 400 years. Over 400 years, generations upon generations of people lived under brutal slavery, awful conditions, horrible treatment and oppression. And not only did that first generation live through it, then kids under them were born into that system. So this was like hundreds of years of bondage and slavery and trauma and really being conditioned generation after generation to have limited expectations of what your life looked like. So when you're born into a system like that, it really changes your mindset. You have a lot of trauma to deal with. It has 100% shaped how you understand the world to work, how you see your future, how you think about your life. So these people were really deeply, deeply programmed into this slavery mindset. And then what happens is that Moses is in the desert in Midian. This is after he grew up in the palace, ended up killing an Egyptian, and fled to the wilderness. He was tending his father-in-law's flock, and he sees the burning bush and rolls up to this burning bush, and God basically tells him, I have come down to rescue the people. I've heard them. I've seen what my people are going through. I have heard their cries. So God says to Moses through the burning bush, I have come down to rescue them from the power of the Egyptians and lead them out of Egypt into their own fertile and spacious land. It is a land flowing with milk and honey. Now you go, you must lead my people out of Egypt. So slavery abounds. God recognizes their oppression after 400 years and decides to send Moses in for this Exodus mission. He's got to get them away from Pharaoh. And so what happens next is all the plagues that you hear about in the Bible. Pharaoh's heart is very hard and he's not willing to let the people go, let those Israelites go. And so finally, judgment sweeps across the Egyptians, and the Spirit of the Lord takes the firstborn sons of everybody that does not have lamb's blood covering their door. So most of the Israelites have heard from God, and they covered lamb's blood over their doors and were protected. Pharaoh's firstborn son dies in this, and that shakes him kind of out of his hard-heartedness long enough to tell Moses, all right, take your people, get out of here. And not only do they tell him, leave, we're done with you, get out of here, God actually puts it on the Egyptians' heart for the Egyptians to give the Israelites their wealth. So as they're leaving town, these Egyptians are giving them money and gold and jewelry, and the Israelites head out of town. They make it out past Egypt and they come to the edge of the Red Sea. And by this time, Pharaoh's realized, oh, geez, I just let all of our slaves go. This was a terrible idea. And he comes racing after them. He brings his army after them in chariots. And Israel cries out to God. Moses cries out to God. And God says, plant your rod in the water and I will rescue you. So he puts his rod in the water. The Red Sea parts. And in the famous story, the Israelites walk through on dry land. After they're done, the seas close again. Boom, waves crash, dead bodies, corpses floating, Pharaoh's dead. Very climactic moment. And then Israel enters the wilderness season. The season of like, okay, now what? God had showed them that there was a land for them. He had made a covenant promise with them that he would be their God and they would be his people and he would provide for them, protect them, that he would drive out the enemies of this land so they could inhabit it and occupy it. But it's like, okay, we got saved, we got delivered, we're not slaves anymore, we are headed right to the promised land. We would expect that God just tells them, hey, X marks the spot, head to this map, let's go to the promised land. But he doesn't. It takes 2 years from the moment the Red Sea parts until they finally reach the boundary, the edge, just the tippy toe into the promised land. So God takes them through this season of what feels like wandering. So they're wandering and they're camping and God gives them instructions and he has them build a tabernacle and his presence inhabits this tabernacle. And so they're setting up camp and they are tearing down camp and moving from place to place. They're following the presence of the Lord as he guides them in a cloud and a pillar of fire. And they do this for 2 years. They get to the edge of the promised land and spies come back and are like, hey guys, we can't do this. There's really big people in there. We are grasshoppers. We're all going to die. We can't do this. And God is like, hey y'all, I already told you I would drive these people out for you. And so as punishment, he says, this older generation that is too afraid to enter, you're going to wander for 40 more years in this wilderness. And I will only let the younger generation, and then Joshua and Caleb, I will only let them enter the promised land. The rest of you, this is your punishment for not trusting me. So it's just this wild 42-year experience. But this is not a wasted experience. This is not a time when there was no activity at all. They were very, very busy and God was using this for a purpose. So what I want to focus on is those 2 years from the Red Sea parting until they get to the edge of the promised land and start looking in. We realize as we study through this that these people were not ready to enter the promised land. So God purposely led them almost in circles, it feels like, through this waiting season, through this wilderness. The Israelites did not have the characteristics that they needed to be successful in their promised land in the next season. They were going to squander it. If God took them immediately from slavery and plopped them into the promise, they would not be ready for it emotionally, physically, mentally, spiritually. And so God had to use the wilderness as a training ground where he shaped them and molded them. He took them from a people of slavery and a slavery mindset and really shaped them into promised land people. And so as we go through it, we're going to notice 3 big themes that God does in our wilderness season. And the first one is reprogramming. The second is protection. And the third one is preparation. So these are 3 big purposes that God has for us in our wilderness season. So let's talk about that slavery mindset and that idea of reprogramming. Because Israel had been enslaved for centuries and were so conditioned to view life and expect certain circumstances, they displayed certain behaviors that really were a slave mindset. They were operating as slaves, even though they had been delivered to freedom. They were totally free now, but it was almost like they didn't know how to handle it. And so God had to reprogram them mentally and emotionally and behaviorally because they acted, they thought, and they operated under that slave mindset, and they didn't have what they needed to conquer the promised land as God expected them to do. God knew he couldn't take this people in bondage and send them into a new space with new battles, new challenges, new expectations. He had to mold them into new people. He had to save them from themselves, because had they entered the promised land the way they were now in that current emotional, mental, spiritual state, they'd get hurt, or they would hurt others. They'd crumble under the weight of it, and they would basically just implode. So this idea of God reprogramming us and the Israelites during the wilderness season has a lot to do with removing old mindsets that are keeping us bound, that are keeping us in chains, that are keeping us from really living and moving and loving and breathing and believing like free people. But it's not enough to just remove them. God had to replace these mindsets with ones that will allow us freedom, flexibility, and deep faith to carry into a new season. And so let's talk about this slave mentality. And I'm going to tell you the ones that the Israelites displayed, because we got to back it up with scripture, y'all. I'm not just making stuff up over here. I'm going to show you what's in scripture, and I want you to think if any of these apply to you. As I walked through this, I could see some of the ones that apply to me now, and I could definitely identify times of transition in my life where I still operated under a chained, bound, slavery mentality. So here we go. Get your pencil. Number one, you might be dealing with a slave mentality if you deeply struggle with change or refuse to leave your comfort zone for new things. So you want to know something fascinating that I found out? Historians and theologians speculate that only a fifth of the Israelites actually left Egypt. So 80% of the Israelites chose not to go with Moses. And this all stems from some of the Hebrew language that's in Exodus 13:17. And it talks about, so God led the people roundabout way by way of the wilderness at the Sea of Reeds. Now the Israelites went up armed out of the land of Egypt. The Hebrew word there is, I'm not going to even say this right, Chemushim? I know I am not saying that right. So it's Chemushim. And the original language has a couple different meanings. One of them is like armed and ready for battle. And the other one translates to like 1 in 5. And so there's kind of this battle in the theological world about, were the Israelites really armed and ready for battle right after they left Egypt? Or is it saying 1/5 of them left? So I don't know. You'll have to do some research on yourself. But if that's true, let's assume that's true and that Hebrew language, that crazy word, really means 1/5. That means that there were people that were so ingrained into that slave life, that were so scared to take on something new, so scared to step out in the unknown. They craved that predictability, that control, that they refused to leave, even after being tortured and starved and oppressed and persecuted and treated like absolute garbage for 400 years. They were still too scared to leave. It's interesting because I think we deal with that today. I really do. I've dealt with it myself. And I think some of us crave structure and control and predictability and the security that we feel from that. We crave that security from it so much that we are willing to stay chained in toxic and awful circumstances to get it. That's one of the slave mindsets that these people had as they left Egypt. Another one is romanticizing the past. You might be operating under a slave mindset if you constantly romanticize the past. So they were unable to really enjoy and lean in and see the great things about their current situation because they were so busy reminiscing about the past. No matter how awful it was or how toxic it was, they remembered it like through rose-colored glasses. Like it was the best experience of their life. So listen to this. Numbers 11, 4 through 6. Oh no, I lied. It's Exodus 13. As soon as they get out of the Red Sea and they're saved and they start moving in the wilderness, it does not take them very long to start romanticizing the past. And they're complaining to Moses and Aaron, who are leading them through the wilderness. And they're saying in Exodus 13, if only the Lord had killed us back in Egypt. There we sat around pots filled with meat and ate all the bread we wanted. But now you have brought us into this wilderness to starve us all to death. They keep complaining. It happens in Numbers 11, 4 through 6 too. Oh, for some meat, they exclaimed. We remember the fish we used to eat for free in Egypt. And we had all the cucumbers, melons, leeks, onions, and garlic we wanted. But now our appetites are gone, and all we ever see is this manna. So God had provided food for them in the wilderness already in the form of manna, these little sweet honey tasting flakes. But that wasn't enough for them. They were yearning and complaining about their current situation and thinking back. They totally forgot that they were being whipped. They were being beaten. They had to literally find their own straw and mud to build their own bricks for the buildings for Pharaoh. And they were dying. They were dying under this torturous rain. But because they had some garlic and some melons, that was better to them. They didn't want to die in the wilderness. So this one really struck me a lot, this idea of romanticizing the past, because I'll do that. I will 100% get stuck and not be able to enjoy the present because I'm thinking about how things used to be. And this actually happened for about a year. I mean, I was stuck in a deep slave mindset for about a year. And it was when, after Chris and I had gotten divorced, and I had lived with somebody in a different town, got into all sorts of nasty stuff, demonic stuff and drugs and all of these things back in Egypt, just in bondage and trauma and just a toxic situation. And so when Chris and I decided to get back together after our divorce, the first year that we were trying to work things out, I was living here in my former home in a beautiful space with my beautiful family, but all I could think about over and over and over was how much I missed my old life and how great it was to be free and how I didn't have to fight with this husband of mine that I was trying to repair my marriage with, and I didn't have all these responsibilities, and I thought it was like the greatest time of my life. And it took a solid year for God to really walk me through that and show me, Amanda, you are spending all your energy and your focus, and you are blocking yourself from really growing and flourishing into this new season because you are wanting this toxic, dirty situation that you were in before. I mean, I had a ton of medical debt. I was doing drugs. I was doing demonic things. I was in a toxic relationship. There was cheating. There was lying. There was legal consequences. And my mind had lied to me enough that that was what I wanted. And so he really freed me from that mindset. And when those chains fell off, when I realized that, hey, you know what God has for me going forward has to be better than what I left behind, that's when I really started walking well into my new season. Check your mind. Check your mind if you're operating under that slavery mindset of romanticizing the past. Another one is slave mindset will have you obsessively focusing on the problem and not the solution. And we see this in the Israelites complaining. And I could throw 150 scriptures at you. It says it so many times about the grumbling of the Israelites, the complaining. They were going after Aaron. They were going after Moses, complaining about food, water, how long they were in the wilderness, how scared they were. It was just deep negativity. That root of complaining is not a solution-oriented mindset. It's a problem-based mindset. This complaining really perpetuates a cycle of like dwelling on problems, and it stops you from actively seeking new solutions or actively looking to God for his solutions. So be careful if you're obsessively focusing on the problem and not the solution. Another slave mindset signal is resorting to old habits or wanting to go back when faced with a challenge. A lot of times when we come up upon challenging things in our lives, we resort to the things that are most comfortable. And the Israelites did this a lot. In Exodus 13, verse 17, Egyptians had been stripped of their wealth. They gave it to Israelites. God was leading them toward the Red Sea. Pharaoh finally let the people go. And it says in verse 17, God did not lead them along the main road that runs through Philistine territory, even though that was the shortest route to the promised land. God said, if the people are faced with a battle, they might change their minds and return to Egypt. God knew that when faced with an oncoming army, these people would be so scared and so triggered that they would immediately revert back to old habits. This also shows up again later in Exodus 14. It says, as Pharaoh approached, the people looked up and panicked when they saw the Egyptians overtaking them. So there's this huge army. They're standing in front of the Red Sea, and they're like, well, we don't have anything else to do. We might as well go back. And so they freaked out, and they said to Moses, why did you bring us out here to die in the wilderness? Weren't there enough graves for us in Egypt? Didn't we tell you this would happen while we were still in Egypt? We said, leave us alone. Let us be slaves to the Egyptians. It's better to be a slave in Egypt than a corpse in the wilderness. So faced with the smallest amount of fear, the smallest amount of adversity, they were ready to turn tail and head back to that measly existence that they had before. And honestly, I think we all do this, or we're very, very tempted to do this. So when things get hard, when your job is tough, when your marriage sucks, when parenting is hard, when money's tight, when you're just angsty for no reason, we all search for comfort. And comfort for us often comes in past things. We look to the past to be comfortable. Sadly, these are not always great habits. Think about substances, alcohol, drugs. We can cope with overeating, shopping. This can be like destructive mindsets from the past that keep us bound, but keep us comfortable. And the second we're triggered, we just adopt that old neural pathway again, and it just plays like a loop over and over. So another one, you guys, we got a few more. You have to listen a little bit faster than this. The next one, how the Israelites operated under a slave mindset and how you might know you're operating in one, is the inability to think for yourself. Always letting other people define you, always looking to someone else for direction, telling you what you can, can't do, what you should or shouldn't do. Now, if you think about the life of the slave, this really makes sense why they were this way. Your whole day was structured. You were told what to do. You were told when to do it. You were told how to do it. You were told if you could or couldn't do it. And so you just learned to operate having your direction come from somebody else and orienting your whole life around the wants and needs of other people. And we do see this after they leave Egypt and they're wandering in the wilderness. The group looks to Moses over and over and over as soon as there's an issue. The word demanded, they demanded from Moses, is used over and over in these few books. They were talking about bitter water. They wanted bread. They wanted food. They wanted protection. So all of these things they were demanding of Moses because they didn't know how to ask God for themselves. Finally, in Exodus 21, God's been using Moses as his sort of mouthpiece this whole time because the Israelites weren't ready or understanding that they could hear from God for themselves. And so Exodus 21:19 says, when God actually was willing to speak to them and appear to them, to the Israelites, they were too scared. And they said, Moses, you speak to us and we'll listen, but don't let God speak directly to us or we will die. And so they really were locked in this mindset of, I just need one person to tell me what to do. even though they had seen these mighty miracles and these like amazing acts of God, they still felt like they could not talk to God themselves, and they could not make decisions for themselves and seek God's wisdom for themselves. And I'm going to tell you what, this is really, really easy for Christians to fall under this mindset, because with the access to sermons on YouTube and podcasts and all these things, it's very easy to connect with God or feel like you're reaching out to God by listening to what other people have to say about him. So we're constantly looking to other people, which is great because they're godly, but we're looking to other people for revelation, for wisdom, for how we make decisions, for what we should do. And sometimes we get so trapped in that we are afraid to approach God for ourselves. And I did that when I first became a Christian. There was a very, very impactful woman in my life who was the one that really helped me come back to God and led me during that first year that I was a Christian. But I remember feeling like I could not make any decision without her. I didn't know if what I was thinking was correct without her. I wanted to run every choice by her. And what she said, I took as Bible. Like, this is 100% how I need to do it. This is when I need to do it. And I was not willing to question that. And so I was putting her on a pedestal and her advice on a pedestal rather than asking God for myself. And you can really see it. In my early journals, there was no conversation between me and God. There was no real prayers. There was no real study of the Bible for my own. It was me taking notes on other people's sermons. And again, that's great. It's a great source of wisdom. It's great teaching. But I truly was scared to talk to God for myself. And I think we get scared to do that because the base fear is, what if I talk to God and he doesn't say anything back? Like, I think for me, sometimes if I don't want to talk to God about something, that's my fear, is what if I need direction, and what if I need help, and what if I need advice? And I finally go to him and he says nothing. And then I feel like an idiot for having tried, and I'm just scared he won't talk to me. And so I think they were operating under that mindset, and it's really easy for us to become enslaved to other people's directions and other people's decisions if we operate in that way too. Okay, guys, we have two more. Hang in there. Second to last one. The Israelites in the wilderness were unable to handle their newfound freedom because they operated in a slave mindset still. And so again, they were used to having their time, their schedule, and their choices all structured for them in this life of slavery. And so when they entered this wilderness and when they were freed from this bondage, they just were just like, what do I do with my hands? Like, they had no idea how to handle it. And so they looked to Moses, they looked to that one person to direct and lead them. But what happens when that person is not available? Watch what they do here. So there was a point when Moses was on the mountain for 40 days and he was receiving the 10 commandments, and he was spending time with God, and he was going to relay information and all these commands back to the people. But after a while without Moses, the people got a little restless and they got a little scared and unsure what to do. And so they told Aaron, make gods who can lead us. We don't know what happened to Moses. So Aaron and the people make a golden calf and basically begin this drunken pagan feast party. So as soon as Moses left and they had no real leader, quote unquote, to help them hear God and to direct them, they were free to make their own choices. And with their own choices, they made this ridiculous golden calf that supposedly was going to lead them on this journey. And then they proceeded to just get drunk and do naked, weird things around this calf. And I'm sure God was up there going, really? Like, bro, I was with Moses for 30 days and you guys lost your mind. And this one is hard for us. When we don't have somebody else dictating our choices, it's very easy to be unsure of how to spend our time when we have freedom, or what to do, or how to act, or how to think. And so this is when it's really key that you ask God. And I ask God this almost every morning. Sometimes I forget and then it doesn't go well. But I tell him, teach me how to number my days. That's a verse. I don't know the reference. I probably should. But teach me how to number my days, Lord, so that my time can honor you. And I want to do what he wants me to do. This was really a struggle for me. When I left teaching and entered the corporate world, like sort of by accident, I started working from home and I had a heck of a lot more freedom than I did in teaching, where your schedule is very, very rigid. You didn't have a lot of space and a lot of choice on what you had to do. And so my first 6 months working from home were a little bit of a disaster. I was like, this is great. I can wear my pajamas all the time and I don't have to wash my hair and I never have to wear makeup and I can sleep right up until my first meeting. I think maybe some of you experienced this in COVID as well when you worked from home, but it's not a healthy way to live. And so it's been almost 3 years now that I've been working from home, and God has slowly taught me, especially in that first year and a half, that I need a routine, that he will structure my routine for me. And so every morning now, I try to get up at the same time and I work out and I shower and I put makeup on and I put my shoes on, because then I can be motivated and do real life. And so I think there are times when that slave mindset, we hit freedom and we just have no idea even how to handle it. Oh, you guys, I'm breathing hard. I need some water. But we are almost finished. Last one. Operating under a slave mindset leads to low self-worth and a victim mentality. All right. I want you to listen to Exodus 13:31. This is when spies are at the edge of the promised land and they're looking to see, like, hey, what kind of land is this? Is it really awesome like God said? What are the people like? We're just going to get some info, some reconnaissance. So they go back, and almost all of these spies, except 2, have this horrible report. It says, we can't go up against them. They are stronger than we are. So they spread this bad report about the land among the Israelites. They said, the land we traveled through and explored will devour anyone who goes to live there. All the people we saw were huge. We even saw giants there, the descendants of Anak. Next to them, we felt like grasshoppers. And that's what they thought too. And so there was this idea, this victim mentality, this low self-worth, this not recognizing that God designed them and had ordered their path so that they would be victorious in this situation. And we lose sight of that all the time. We lean into this victim role that things are happening to us, that we are small, that we are lowly, that nothing we do matters because the situation to our natural eyes looks impossible. When we think that way, we tend not to move into things with authority, and we tend not to try to conquer things because we feel like we don't deserve it. First of all, we feel like nothing can ever change. And we start comparing ourselves to other people who seem to have it way better than us. So instead of like putting our head down, watching our own bobber, and like moving forward into something God has for us, we are so busy wasting time, wasting energy, and wasting this emotional like victimhood, eyeing up what other people have or feeling even worse about what we're going through. I think that's true for a lot of us when we're in a wilderness season. When we're moving towards a promise or a transition and we're not quite there yet, we tend to seek out people who are already on the other side of it, and we see them thriving and we see them doing well, and we automatically assume, I can't do it like they can. Why are they there and I'm not here yet? So we deal with jealousy and we deal with comparison, and then we just tend to get stuck there. Okay, I will put all of these points in the show notes if you need to reference them again, because we don't have time to go back through and skim all of them again. But here's what I want to say about that slave mentality, about needing to be reprogrammed and needing to be molded and prepared by God to move into your promised land, to move into your next season. A slave mentality will always have you looking somewhere else other than forward. So if you are operating under a slave mentality, you're either busy looking around at everybody else, what they're doing, what they have, where they are, or you're looking backwards. And so I think one of the biggest differences in the Israelites' journey is that after they left Egypt and they were moving in the wilderness, they were moving away from something. They were leaving something behind. And it wasn't until much, much, much later in their journey, after God had really prepared them, that they were doing a purposeful march towards something new. And so I just want you to think about that. Where am I looking backwards? Where am I looking everywhere else but forwards? Am I running away from something or trying to escape something? Or do I have a true vision, a clarity, a hope, and a purpose of the next season and the next promise that God has for me? Woo! I'm sweating a little bit. I feel like I can take a breath now. That was a lot. That was a lot to get through today, and I know that. Like the background, setting up the context, moving through those 6, 7, 10 points. I don't know. We'll put it in the show notes. But moving through all those points to really identify the Israelites' slave mindset and apply it to your own life is going to set the stage for the next podcast, talking about why. Why did they need reprogramming? And then what happened next after you get old mindsets and perspective and behaviors removed from your life and God starts to tweak those, they have to be replaced with something new. And so in the next podcast, we are going to talk about how God replaces these behaviors with new ones, and the people really start to come out of slavery and truly into who they need to be, the characteristics they need to have to enter the promised land and do it well. Tune in next time. Thanks for hanging in. I hope you got a journal full of notes and a heart full of Jesus. We'll talk soon. Bye.